there are problems that can come along with being gifted at something. When you have a great deal of ability, there are rewards that can come along with it that can separate you from other people. So I'll use the example of young athletes who, have been drafted in a high round for the NFL, for example. So obviously very gifted people physically, and sometimes gifted in a variety of other ways. Some of them are great musicians, very deep and incisive thinkers. But at a very young age, you come into immense wealth, which immediately puts a division between you and the rest of the world. So the anxiety of figuring out what to do with that wealth is something that a lot of people perhaps don't think about who are on the outside. And I think, frankly, the dealing with the tensions that emerge in families, because now, in some cases, the hierarchy has changed because you're the one with all the resources now. It's not your father, not your mom. And, frankly, a lot of people come at you with their hands out. So I think that that's one example or one way in which being a person identified as gifted by the society can actually engender problems with emotions, problems with interpersonal relationships. And that's basically what it boils down to for all of the people who are twice exceptional that I've worked with. They're either having emotional problems that are connected in some way to their particular brand of giftedness, or they're having interpersonal problems. I think we'll make it. I think we'll make the cut. I think we'll make the cut.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me put my headphones on. We are back. Another episode of No Supervision. Got a special guest with us here today. I'm going to give him the opportunity to introduce himself. Please, sir, tell us your name, what you do, and where you're from.
Dr. Kenneth Etefia, adult and child psychiatrist. And I work in both the Bay Area, so San Francisco Bay Area, and also Los Angeles.
You are also the tallest person to ever step foot in this
Yeah,
podcast.
I did have to do some bending to get into this room, and I will admit it's it's freaking me out. It's a little claustrophobic. It's inducing some claustrophobia for me, but it's all right. The world's not built for people my size.
How tall are you exactly?
I am 6 feet 6 inches.
I thought you were 6'5".
No, man, no.
You're 6'6"?
I was probably 6'5" sometime in medical school, maybe a year or two after. I swear, this is something that sounds completely inconsistent with what we know about the science of growth, but I'm pretty sure I kept growing until I was in my mid-20s.
No way.
Yeah, because I have a very close friend, and we were roughly the same height when we were in college together. And I went to his wedding 10 years ago, and I was probably 4 inches taller than him.
No.
Yeah.
No. The latest I've seen anybody grow is like 18.
It might have been the pressure of marriage that shrunk him a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe kids.
Starting off high.
Yeah.
Starting off high,
yeah,
kid.
man. I told you, just off the top of the head today. So.
Starting off high, man.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you're rare in that regard too. You're rare because you're also a child and adolescent psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're 6'6". I can imagine when you run into kids and you're towering over them.
That's true. I'm black too, which is also rare in this field. I don't know if you've noticed, but yeah, I certainly do. But the funny thing is about kids, I was really anxious about this when I was in training. I had a supervisor whose name I can't really remember, but it was at Stanford. And I noticed that almost all the patients I was working with were white. And these were like little white kids. And I expressed to him that I was worried that race would become an issue. And he actually gave me some pretty sage advice. He's like, kids don't care.
Right.
They really don't. And I've actually found that to be true over the decades. Like, race doesn't matter for kids. I think that it's not really until I run into people who are like mid-adolescent age that we really have serious conversations about race. But kids are incredibly open-minded. And as far as size goes, unless they come from some kind of traumatic environment or they've been exposed to violence, like a big person's just a curiosity. It's not a reason to be afraid or to be avoidant or be cautious.
And one thing that it seems like you like about kids is the fact that kids are just kind of like a blank slate.
What do I like about kids? That's a very good question.
Well, please
Thomas.
tell us. You're a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I thought I picked up on something, but maybe you can clarify.
Well, you know, I got into this business because I had an interest in intellectual development from a very early age. So I grew up in a household without a lot of money, but with a fair number of books around. And I grew up around people who, at least if not completed college, had dabbled in college and had brought those texts back and like left them scattered around the house. So one of the books, we had one book, it was called Freud A to Z. So I remember reading that when I was in elementary school. And, you know, I mean, you can imagine what it was like. It's basically a listing of a bunch of neuroses, things that kind of parlance people don't really use today. And then there was a book, a full text on cognitive neuroscience. And I remember kind of leafing through it, and it probably looked, for lack of a better expression, like Greek to me at the time. But there was something interesting about it. And there were pictures of the brain, and there was enough vocabulary that I probably understood in elementary school to kind of build a framework in my mind about what was being described.
Right. So and this is in Miami, Florida.
This is in Miami. Yeah.
Okay. So in Miami, Florida, you said that you were surrounded by books around you, and
this is at home. Yeah.
Yeah. And were you encouraged to read those, or did you just do it on your own?
I was a latchkey kid. So most of the encouragement I had was internal.
Okay.
I grew up in a working class Black and brown community in Miami, a place that doesn't exist anymore called Carroll City. You might know it from maybe a few popular rappers that claim the city as their own, but quite literally it doesn't exist anymore.
What do you mean it doesn't? Carroll City doesn't?
Yeah, it was rebranded as Miami Gardens.
Oh, that's Miami Gardens?
Yeah. So Miami Gardens used to be a separate neighborhood when I was a kid. And Carroll City was a separate neighborhood with its own high school, own middle school, so on and so forth. And when I was a kid, I'm pretty sure Miami Gardens had its own either grade school, middle school, something like that. But it was known to be a separate neighborhood. I think Miami Gardens, I think kids from there went to a school called Golden Glades, maybe from middle school. But it was a different neighborhood. And it was a little bit nicer, just in terms of kind of the physical layout, proximity to the big library, proximity to the parks.
Miami Gardens.
Than where I lived. Carroll City, you know, basically I grew up in a subdivision that was across the street from a housing project. So those were my playmates. It was kids from my immediate neighborhood, and then we'd walk across the street barefoot and go hang out in the projects, and we'd go back and forth. So it was a very enlightening way, or it was an enlightening experience because it taught me about how in this country you can have a very close proximity to real poverty and be deluded into thinking that it's much farther, that it's much more remote from your day-to-day existence.
All right. So with that you've been on a long journey.
It doesn't feel that way.
Doesn't feel that way?
No, because talking to you, and I have a good memory, but I don't think it's like, you know, it's not like Guinness Book of World Records good, but I can remember things vividly from elementary school, middle school.
Wow.
You know, it doesn't seem, now that I'm at this point in my early 40s, it doesn't seem like it was that long of a journey. It really doesn't.
Wow. Yeah. Well, when you tell me stories of your journey, it seems like you've done so many different things. You've lived in different countries. You've lived in different parts of different parts of this country as well. Yeah. How do you feel about where you are right now? In career child psychiatry, do you like what you do? Why? That's
a good question. I think about this a lot, actually, because I'm one of those people who grew up liking a lot of different things. Like, I think I told you before, I majored in finance in college. Like this, you know, I took one class in abnormal psychology and hated it. I was like, why would anybody do this? This doesn't seem like something a serious person would do for a career. And plus, these people don't get better. And, I went to Princeton for undergraduate, and my goal was to make sure I never had to live the way that we lived when I was a kid. So my goal by going there was to do something like finance. I remember this at 17. My goal was to go there, major in finance, go to Harvard Business School, and work for Goldman Sachs. I actually wrote that in an essay when I was 17, and I won first prize.
Bold move.
Scholarship.
Yeah.
Scholarship to college.
You put that in your essay.
Yeah. It was about changing the world, and I just wrote about like the most self-interested, self-involved topics you could imagine, just like acquiring wealth as quickly as possible. But they went for it. They really went for it. I think that there's something compelling about running into a young person who has a clarity of vision, right? So this was a departure for me. I got into medicine because when I did something called financial engineering, to be more specific. So that's a lot of applied math, but it's applied math techniques that kind of teach you how to game the market, how to predict what stocks are going to do, more or less, and how to deal with exotic asset classes and the kind of maneuvers you can do on those exotic classes. So there was a woman who came from a school in New York City, a medical school, who gave a talk at the engineering school about an early admission program for engineers. So I went, I attended because the idea of medicine was always in the back of my mind. I think I had an early interest in science, and I was lucky enough as a kid to get routed to some enrichment courses through my public elementary school. And I'll talk about that in a minute, because I think that there can be great advantages for Black children in particular going to predominantly Black schools with like Black staff.
Yeah.
I think that it can be an enriching experience in ways that people might not really get. But yeah, so firstly, I was identified as someone who had ability when I was young, and they routed me into those classes. I developed an interest in science, which has kind of been with me my whole life. So when I was in college, she came and she was just talking about how the medical school was intent on getting more people with engineering backgrounds into medicine because we want you to be researchers and we want you to go into these different specialties and this and that. And, I really took to heart what she was saying, and I decided to apply. So
how old are you at this point?
I was 19.
19, okay.
Yeah, so I applied for medical school when I was 19, and the summer after, sophomore year, I found out I got in.
How did you apply at 19?
It was an early admission program. They use your SAT scores,
got it.
and they use your grades from the first year and a half of college.
Got it.
Right.
You mentioned that you had always been thinking about medicine. Are you talking about elementary, middle school, or are you talking about just high school?
I think if you go far enough back in my history, it was probably being a fireman first.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Oddly enough, my mother was a police officer. She was a detective for the county police for like 30 years. Never thought about being a cop.
Okay. Yeah.
Never really crossed my mind. But the idea of being a fireman, certainly. And beyond that, it's hazy. I don't remember much else. I think that Ben Carson was an influence when I was younger, and it's kind of a shame to me to see what he's become.
Interesting direction he's chosen to go with this.
Interesting. I think heartbreaking.
Yeah. That's another word. That's another word.
Yeah, but I remember in 8th grade reading Healing Hands, and it was the first real life example I had of a Black male physician. I had family medicine doctors, I had, a dentist, but none of them were Black men. And it was particularly valuable for me to see a Black man who devoted his life to science and built an entire how should I put this? I think what was really impressive about it was not only that he built a life through science and found a way to support his family and a way to keep himself stimulated, but he knew, if you read the book, like you understand that he understands that he acknowledges that his story is inspirational. And I like the fact that he decided to write a book, and it felt like there was a connection between him at Johns Hopkins, this world-renowned neurosurgeon, And me, like a 13-year-old black kid in Miami,
Right.
with a single parent and, living in a place that looked forgotten.
Miami, that is your neighborhood.
Right, exactly. And it made me think that maybe my environment wasn't all that different from the Detroit that he grew up in as a kid.
I would imagine many people have never actually sat down with a child and adolescent psychiatrist or a psychiatrist in general.
Well, they have now.
But they have now. Let's imagine, because I'm sure you and I have had this conversation multiple times with somebody that might be hesitant to meet a psychiatrist and even more hesitant about meeting a child and adolescent psychiatrist for their child.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you would like for them to know about what you do, how most psychiatrists would approach their treatment? What are some thoughts that you have to sort of alleviate some of their concerns?
Well, I can't tell you about what most doctors would do because it's almost an impossible thing to answer. It would be like trying to describe how most surgeons in a specialty would engage with you. Hard to say.
Fair enough.
You're dealing with human beings, different personalities, who all bring something different to the mix.
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, if you're coming to see an outpatient psychiatrist like me, in my practice, it's going to be a 100-minute introduction where I try to learn as much about you as possible in that 100-minute span to figure out what sort of diagnosis makes sense. And I say diagnosis with some I say that with a bit of caution because I'm not a believer in what are called categorical diagnoses. So we have an entire mental health system built up on binary diagnoses. That is, either someone is healthy or they are ill. And unless they meet a very specific functional definition of what illness is, then they don't have it and they're healthy. When in truth, we know many people are in between cases who are clearly not healthy, not functioning well, but don't meet the strict definition of unipolar depression or the strict definition of alcoholism, but they're struggling. So I'm a believer in dimensional diagnoses, which are growing more and more popular, which is where you think of health and wellness, health and illness as a part of the same spectrum. It's a continuum of symptoms or experiences that people can have. Everyone gets depressed sometimes. Everyone gets anxious sometimes. Doesn't mean that those are states of illness. However, for some people who are on the more extreme end of the spectrum, they will have life-altering levels of depression, life-altering levels of anxiety, which is what we need to target in the mental health field. So there is a turn towards more dimensional diagnosis in mental health, which is great. There's more and more research supporting that idea, as well as a push to get us to the point where we actually have biomarkers that we can use for dimensional diagnosis. So if you want to diagnose something like depression, maybe we should be tracking something like, let's say, a certain gene that codes for a certain type of serotonin receptor. And that's just me making something up.
Receptor X.
Right, exactly, right. And basically, based on the activity level of that gene, you could definitively diagnose whether there is depression or not. Right, or the clinical depression. That is getting away from the binary idea.
Right. We're not quite there yet, unfortunately.
We're not there.
Yeah, we're not there. There's a lot of work that I think needs to be done. I mean, right now, the papers that have come out about what serotonin really does or doesn't do has come out. And I think most, and I'm saying most psychiatrists, I think a lot of psychiatrists, or at least the ones that I'm in connection with, have known that antidepressants or SSRIs are not curative. They are doing something for patients, but I don't think anyone was describing them or prescribing them to patients as something that was curative.
That's interesting you say that because I'm of a different opinion. I think they are curative for some people.
Okay.
And I think the problem with the way research is done, the mainstay of medical research is something called the randomized controlled trial. There are problems with that. One, randomized controlled trials are based on a Gaussian distribution. And not to get too technical, but that means that it presumes that there is a normal curve, and people can look that up if they're interested, that explains the frequency of certain types of illnesses in a natural population. But there are illnesses that don't conform to a Gaussian curve that people still experience. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that if you're looking at aggregate effects, if you're looking at the effectiveness of a drug over dozens to hundreds of people, how much does that really tell you about response on an individual level? Because if you're just saying that, okay, well, this drug doesn't do a very good job of lowering the level, the severity of depression for the entire group, that doesn't mean that there aren't people that have, let's say, a certain genetic profile in that group that we just haven't determined yet, who do respond very strongly to that drug, who do get better. And that's the problem, because if you're just looking at averages, like average, drop in depressive rating score, that can get lost. Like the effect of those people, if they're a relatively small group in that sample, could get lost. So there's actually a trend towards more individualized kind of N of one studies in mental health, at least, where there is more analysis of individual effects rather than group effects when it comes to things like medications.
Yeah. Let me be more clear what I meant by curative. I only think medicine has two cures: surgery and antibiotics. Only cures.
Yeah.
Cures, what I mean when I say that term, that means you give it or you do that thing once and you don't have to deal with it ever. Everything else, for me at least, is treatment.
Yeah.
Very effective treatments are SSRIs, but they're not curative. That's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
All right. So you've been a child and adolescent psychiatrist for many years. Okay. What are the types of patients that you like to help the most?
So that's a very good question. I really enjoy working with athletes. So my practice is a part of the player. We're one of the referral. How should I put this? We're on the mental health registry for the NFL. So the player assistance program will list our practice as one of the practices that players can reach out to if they need mental health support. So I really like that part of my job. And we also are part of the U.S. Olympic Mental Health Registry.
Awesome.
So I like that too.
Awesome.
So but generally speaking, I like working with what you might call twice exceptional people, which is a term borrowed from the world of, for lack of a better term, gifted education, which really refers to people who've been identified as quote unquote gifted in some way, either intellectually, creatively, physically, but who also have mental health issues or learning issues.
Okay. See, when you first mentioned this term to me, that was the first time I'd heard of it. And I think I asked a few colleagues / friends. Never heard of it either.
Wow, that's incredible.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field.
It's been around for a long time too.
It's not new. Yeah, there's a whole movie, Little Man Tate, with Jodie Foster. I highly recommend to you and anyone else listening.
Okay.
It's fantastic because it's about a kid who has a super high intellectual potential kid who is also struggling with some pretty serious emotional issues.
Okay.
And a tough family dynamic, and it's really interesting.
So this is actually, because oftentimes, and you know how this goes when people are portraying psychiatrists and psychologists in the media, it's terrible. It's not even close to what we do.
Yeah.
Would you say that this movie is pretty close to what you might expect, or?
Interestingly, the movie doesn't focus much on what the psychiatrist does. There is a female psychiatrist, which might be a psychologist, who's the head of the program. And for people who might not know, the difference being a psychiatrist is a medical doctor first and foremost, who specializes in mental health. Psychologist is someone who's not a medical doctor, who goes to graduate school, gets a PhD, and either does research or clinical work. So she might have been a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but it's really focused on a program that she develops, which is kind of like the Center for Talented Youth at Johns Hopkins. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No.
So that's like a 40 or 50-year-old program for kids who are identified as having super high intellectual potential by the time they're in middle school usually. And if you qualify, you can go to Johns Hopkins and you can take enrichment courses over the summer. And sometimes you can take college classes at a very young age.
Okay.
Right.
But this movie, though,
it's more about
in terms
that.
of your recommendation.
It won't really teach you what it's like for a psychologist or psychiatrist to work with gifted kids. in sort of the mundane, kind of everyday sense of what happens when they show up to the office. It's more about this clinician, this psychologist or psychiatrist, kind of running a program that caters to the needs of these kids, which I think is fascinating in and of itself, and the kind of conflict that can cause with families the kids come from.
Got it. Got it. Understood.
Yeah.
See, when I first started asking colleagues about it, and no one knew what it was, I looked it up some more.
Yeah.
And the thought that popped into my head as a portrayal of it would be something like Rain Man.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a professor when I was at Stanford who was the head of child psychiatry at the time, who pointed out when he was teaching us about folks who were neurodivergent.
Could you really quickly, what is the definition of neurodivergent?
Right. So neurodivergent, I think the most straightforward definition I can give is that basically we're referring to a community of people who differ in behaviors due directly to differences in brain design.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Got it.
The common conception is that, yeah, you're going to be a Rain Man type savant, spitting out or reciting train tables, something like that. Counting how many beans spilled on the floor when a jar tips over.
Right. Stuff you see online.
Right. Which is different. That is a feature that can be associated with autism called savantism.
Okay.
Right. Which happens very rarely. People might not realize this, but it's actually much more common for people with autism to have intellectual difficulties.
Okay.
Right. Not to have extraordinary intellectual gifts.
Got it.
Right. So about 2/3 roughly of people with autism diagnoses also qualify as intellectually disabled.
Got it.
Right.
Got it. So someone that is twice exceptional, they are gifted in some area, but they have maybe would you say it a deficiency or difficulties?
I'll give you some examples.
Yep.
So one example would be a kid who, let's say, and I'm not a strong believer in IQ, so I should preface this statement, but let's say they score in the top 2% for their age level on a standard IQ test like the Wechsler.
Okay.
So they would be identified by most school districts that use IQ tests as being intellectually gifted as a result and routed towards some form of special education. But a kid like that could also have a writing disorder or a reading disorder, surprisingly, or a math disorder.
Got it.
Yeah, you can be both.
Okay, understood.
Right.
So what are some of the struggles that some of these people that you work with, in other words, you're helping them with something.
Yeah.
What are some of the most common struggles that you help them with?
Well, it depends on age, but if we're talking about kids with this sort of twice exceptional profile, it's tricky. There is being a part of a gifted education program is a great advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. So it's an advantage in the sense that you can get something tantamount to a private school level education through the public education system if you qualify for one of these programs.
Okay.
But I think the disadvantage, and I've heard adult people who are in gifted programs attest to this, is that the burden of expectation is great.
Wow.
And in some cases, it can be crushing because you go from being perhaps the smartest kid in your mainstream elementary school class to, in some cases, like when I grew up in Miami, there was something called full-time gifted that a cousin of mine was actually routed to, where they basically plucked her out of her regular school and made her go to a satellite school, or offered that she could go to enroll in a satellite school that was several miles away, where she was just around gifted kids all the time and was only given gifted level instruction. So for some people, it's fantastic. I think that it can really nurture kids who have extraordinary intellectual gifts, which was true for her. She went to Harvard for undergrad and law school.
Mm-hmm.
But in other cases, I have another friend from growing up who was routed to gifted education. By the time he was in first grade, barely got out of high school. And when I asked him about it, what he described is that the burden of expectation was so great that he didn't try.
Overwhelming.
Exactly, because he was told at an early age that he should be able to do X, Y, and Z. And then when it came to the effort part and the struggle part, I think that he might have interpreted that in his young mind as a failure. Why is this hard for me? I have this gift. And is it always going to be hard for me to learn certain things? Like, what does that mean? And what if the people around me aren't struggling? What if these other gifted kids happen to be more gifted than I am? So it's problematic, I think. I think that identifying a kid as gifted can cause emotional harm. And I think it's a tough decision for parents to make in school districts where gifted education is still a thing, because in many school districts, it really isn't anymore. But yeah, parents have to think very carefully. And I think parents need to be very careful about disclosing the specific details of how the kid qualified for the gifted program to the kid. Because back in my day, there were kids who were walking around knowing what their IQs were. And again, that's something that could also be damaging to a kid.
As a part of their identity.
Exactly, right. And I think for my one friend, that he had kind of internalized that number as meaning a bunch of things, when in truth it's just an abstraction. It's just the average of a bunch of different subtests that captured your performance on a very narrow range of mental exercises on one day of your life. That's it.
Problem solving,
Yeah.
solving puzzles and quizzes, not necessarily
Exactly.
how you interact with other people, and not how you handle stress,
Right.
social, and yeah.
Right. And also, there's so many problems with these tests, but one of them is that they're coachable. There are a number of studies that have shown that either explicit coaching can change how kids do on the exam significantly, but also just suggestion, like telling kids, let's say there have been studies where kids have just been told that they're gifted, and their performance on IQ tests are compared before they receive the suggestion and then after. The scores are significantly different. The same has been true in the opposite direction, where kids who were identified as gifted beforehand were given an IQ test and then told they weren't gifted. Again, significant differences in scores. Another problem with testing kids at super early ages, like elementary school age, is that the scores tend not to be stable.
They change over
Exactly, right. There can be a regression to the mean as kids grow up. And then how do you deal with that as an educator or a parent, particularly a parent?
And what you mean by that is some kids that are
who
maybe
have
have developed-
internalized the idea that they're intellectually gifted because of this number, this performance they receive. By the time they're in middle school or high school, are scoring close to average on an IQ test.
No, but by regression to the mean, just for people that are listening, you mean there are kids that they mature a little faster, score higher on the test early, and then they sort of normalize as they get older.
Exactly.
And now they're not as far apart from other kids as they thought they were.
Exactly.
Which is a blow to their identity.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, well put. And that could happen for a lot of different reasons. It could be because, this test is an estimate of something that we don't understand very well. That's part of it. And then there are all of the other factors that people typically consider to be important when it comes to intelligence, like, how enriched your environment is, how many books are at home, basically, how educated your parents are, and kind of nutrition you receive.
Something is swirling in my head, and I want to make sure I articulate it properly. I have this idea in my head that for those kids that are identified as exceptional, the standards are set pretty high for them. They have standards. Whereas for some kids, I feel like they don't really get the same standards. So they don't have that same self-esteem as other kids. It's sort of, I'm not articulating it properly, but I think you know what I'm saying. Maybe you feel what I'm saying here, that the kids that are identified exceptional, they get these high standards placed on them, which are crushing, right? And then there are other kids who don't really have any standards set for them at all. It's
and frankly, I think that's why where I went to school, I went to a working class school for elementary, a place called Carroll City Elementaries. And we had a lot of kids in our classes who would act out. And I think that, and I'm going to go back to Erik Erikson, who was a great thinker on the development of human beings. That is social and emotional development. I believe he was a Swiss psychologist. But Erik Erikson opined that when you're in elementary school, you need to develop some type of proficiency at something. It's an important part of your development as a kid to feel like you're good at something.
Almost anything.
Anything, whether it's sports, music, being popular, whatever. Like it's a necessary part, he thought, of not only building healthy self-esteem, but helping you resolve the conflicts that come along with being a kid. Like you need that base of security that, hey, this kid doesn't like the way my ears look, for example, or this girl doesn't like me. She's not going to return my Valentine's Day card. But I have this core of stability centered around the fact that not only, my parents love me and I have people who support me, but also that I know that I did this thing myself. I know that I'm capable of being good at something and I can respect myself for that. And also, his theory was that if you don't resolve the conflicts of that stage, then they're going to follow you for the rest of your life until you do resolve them.
He's one of my favorite psychologists.
Right.
Yeah, he's
right.
my favorite, I think.
Right. So I think that a lot of the kids that I remember who were pushed out of class, for fighting, it was usually fighting where I grew up, were probably kids who were under-nurtured at home and probably didn't feel like they were particularly good at anything. Didn't feel like they had anything to be proud of.
Yeah.
Because I would notice that the kids that they would assault were usually the kids who were well-groomed, looked like they were well cared for, bright. Those were the kids that were typically targeted, not other kids who seemed to be struggling.
If there's no reason to act appropriately, then you're just not going to act appropriately. You just lash out at people.
Right. But I also think it's what we'd call in our field projective identification, where you're feeling miserable and you want to make the people around you feel that way. Yeah. So you're not going to identify another kid who's already miserable. You're going to go for someone who seems like they're successful. Right.
Yeah. What you described, I don't know if they did this with your first days in medical school.
Yeah.
I think it was the second day of medical school. They sat us all down in a room and they put up a chart. I don't remember the specifics of what was on the chart, but they essentially said all of you are top 5% in your undergrads, probably top 1% in your high schools, middle schools. Right. And now all of you are in one room. You can't all be top 5%, top 1%, because they were having so many struggles with new medical students coming in who are used to being on top. And then when they're in a group of other students, somebody's got to be fourth quartile.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to me to hear that because I can understand it completely. But my background was so different from that.
Yeah.
Like, I actually didn't care at all about school until I was about 15. And that's when I realized that if I didn't act fast, I probably wouldn't have many opportunities after high school was over. And that's when I really started to apply myself. But until then, I wasn't one of those people. Like, to your point, I went to medical school with people who went to a variety of very, very competitive colleges who told me that, I remember one guy told me that he decided he was going to go to Harvard when he was like in third grade. And that was his one singular purpose in life. Like he pushed himself and he got there, but by the time he got there, he had an ulcer. Right.
Yeah.
So, and he was like 18 years old. So I never came from that. And I think that's one of the good things about coming from a very humble background. There was an idea in the atmosphere when I was a kid that I'd go to college. But beyond that, what I would do, the name of the school, none of that came into play.
The bar wasn't set to the point where it was unachievable for you.
The expectation was not crushing.
Right.
The expectation was just enough to stimulate and inspire, not to destroy.
And the expectation doesn't sound like it was just that only. It was for those people like the one you just described,
Yeah.
that's their only purpose. If you don't get
Right.
into Princeton, you don't get into Harvard, you're
right.
nothing.
Right. I think that's probably how someone like that set it up in their mind. I think so. I don't know if they were getting that message from family or what.
I've seen it set up from family.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
I went to high school with a guy like that who was, boy, he was a troubled guy. Very, very troubled guy. And not to pick on Harvard, but he went to Harvard. And he was just nasty to so many people.
Mm-hmm.
And he just had this deep, deep insecurity that really, it was, even to people at high school level, it was just transparent. I remember watching him cause a very sweet girl in his class who was ranked, I think, number 2 in the class, or they were vying for the number 1 spot. He made her cry in our physics class.
Was he number 1?
I think they were both tied.
They were tied.
Because I was a junior, I was in AP physics, and they were both seniors.
Got it.
And yeah, he just made her cry. He called her a dummy or something because she couldn't understand something. He was just berating her. And I don't know why the teacher didn't intervene. Teacher might have been out of the room because it was a really good teacher, probably one of the best in the school, who wouldn't have tolerated it. But I think either the teacher was out or out of the room, out for the day or out of the room. And yeah, he just made this girl cry. And I remember just being confused. Like, I'd never seen anyone treat a person like that in an environment like this, because I went to a high school that was like a private school. It was a competitive magnet school on an island called Key Biscayne. And yeah, it was, it's kind of like what happened at the Oscars with Chris Rock and Will Smith. I think if that had happened in a bar on a Friday night, no one would have been surprised.
Mm-hmm.
But because it happened in that environment, people were like paralyzed. They were like stunned. It was kind of like that,
It was a different form of aggression.
It was, and it was out of place. It felt completely out of place, and the victim felt, it was bizarre that she was the victim because she barely spoke. Like, she was like a very sweet, reticent sort of young girl. So anyway, but I think he is obviously an example of someone who falls into the category you were describing, where this was the one singular purpose and maybe the only thing that helped them feel good about themselves, just the prospect. So of course, when he got waitlisted first, he didn't handle that very well.
Yeah. And I think the sad thing is, even though that's their only purpose, why you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
Sometimes when you get it, what you thought you wanted, it's still not.
Oh, it's so funny. As a senior, he actually came back to our high school and ended up coming to visit my English teacher. He was still full of venom. And she asked him how he liked Harvard. He's like, all he had were complaints. It's cold. It's gray all the time.
Yeah.
Like, it sounded like he was depressed, frankly.
Yeah. Probably. There has to be, you mentioned this earlier. I can't remember the specific words that you used, but you essentially described somebody that has something to hold on to. It's better to have multiple things.
Of course.
Family that cares about you, hobbies.
Those are signifiers of health.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That you're connected to people who love you, you love them, you value yourself in many different ways, not just because you're a great singer, great athlete, great at math, whatever. Like, you're multifaceted.
Yeah.
Not only in what you can do, but in the way in which you conceive of yourself.
Looking at all those characteristics of people, and obviously you're passionate about them, how are they helped? What do you do for them?
Oh, you're talking about the twice exceptional.
The twice exceptional people.
Yeah. So firstly, I want to point out that there's no real evidence that statistically these people are at greater risk for any sort of mental health issue than other folks walking.
Okay.
So I want to make that clear. But there are problems that can come along with being gifted at something. When you have a great deal of ability, there are rewards that can come along with it that can separate you from other people. So I'll use the example of young athletes who, have been drafted in a high round for the NFL, for example. So obviously very gifted people physically, and sometimes gifted in a variety of other ways. Some of them are great musicians, very deep and incisive thinkers. But at a very young age, you come into immense wealth, which immediately puts a division between you and the rest of the world. So the anxiety of figuring out what to do with that wealth is something that a lot of people perhaps don't think about who are on the outside. And I think, frankly, the dealing with the tensions that emerge in families, because now, in some cases, the hierarchy has changed because you're the one with all the resources now. It's not your father, not your mom. And, frankly, a lot of people come at you with their hands out. So I think that that's one example or one way in which being a person identified as gifted by the society can actually engender problems with emotions, problems with interpersonal relationships. And that's basically what it boils down to for all of the people who are twice exceptional that I've worked with. They're either having emotional problems that are connected in some way to their particular brand of giftedness, or they're having interpersonal problems. So whether it's a kid who's been identified as a math genius who just can't make friends because her brain works differently and her interests are different, and perhaps their parents haven't helped them enough with socialization. So where I come in is usually strategizing with parents on how best to give young people who fall into this category a set of experiences that will facilitate their social and emotional development.
Okay.
Right. Because sometimes the parents are really similar to the kids, very, very bright people who were also just introverted, not really all that connected to people. But somehow they found one other person to mate with, in spite of those obstacles. So the Bay Area makes it easy in particular because there are a lot of kids who fall into that category, and there are multiple private schools and clinics devoted to the care of gifted children. So it's not really that hard to find resources in an area like that. LA is the same. There's a place called the Merman School, which is a school for kids who are intellectually gifted, like extremely intellectually gifted. So there are resources in places like LA and San Francisco. There are also community-based programs that are really designed for people who are neurodivergent, but could also be helpful for kids who are identified as super high intellectual potential kids, because interestingly enough, there's actually an overlap in traits between kids on the autistic spectrum and kids with high intellectual potential.
Look, so I'm curious about people who do not live in San Francisco or Los Angeles. Okay. I see that head nod.
It's harder.
Some of you can't see his head nod, but
I think the key is living near a big city. If you have a kid that falls into one of those categories and you're looking for community resources or educational resources, it helps to either be in a very well-funded school district or it helps to be near a big city.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in New York, Miami, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Jackson, Mississippi. I knew a guy from there who went to a school for the gifted for high school. So if you are, and I was just thinking of a school in Virginia, the name of which escapes me, Thomas Jefferson, the high school. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
When I was in school, TJ was.
Which part of Virginia are you from?
Richmond.
Okay. I don't know if the TJ I'm thinking
of there might be multiple
Richmond.
TJs.
Yeah, this one's, I think, in Alexandria.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
right. No, that one's one of the best schools in the country.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But, they like to.
There's multiple TJs.
They like to stick these names on schools all over the country.
Okay, I got you. Anyway, yes.
Right.
So, So if you're in a larger city or a capital
right.
city of that state,
it'll be easier for you as a parent to navigate. And also, you'll be closer to psychiatrists that can help you out, and also psychologists and every other brand of mental health professional. But again, just to sort of capsule summary what we're talking about here, in general, you have a population of people who can have extreme abilities in one area, but also extreme difficulties when it comes to emotions and also certain aspects of learning. If you live in a place that's well-funded or you're near a big city, it's probably going to be a pretty straightforward exercise to find supportive resources. If you don't, it's going to be more difficult. However, if you do think that either your child falls into this category, or perhaps you, if you fall into that category as an adult, need more support, then you can definitely meet with a psychologist, a psychiatrist. And I think that the experience for kids who engage with a psychiatrist for, let's say, depression or anxiety that's linked to difficulties with social connection because they are so different in terms of their ability, in many cases, I think can be remedied with just talk therapy and finding good community resources, ways to help that young person connect with other kids their age. Sometimes it'll just be group therapy where they just need to sit in an environment and have moderated conversations with other kids to learn how to do it.
Yeah. I always like to hear when psychiatrists say talk therapy.
Of course. Yeah.
I think people appreciate that too.
Sure,
I really do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I have another question. So,
and by the way, if you're older, finding a group for people who might have difficulty with social functioning could be really helpful for someone who falls in the twice exceptional category. If you are someone who has exceptional ability in other ways, sometimes it's helpful just finding a network of other men or women who are dealing with the same thing. So one of the interesting things about athletes is that if you play a professional sport, then you usually have a natural community of people who are going through the same thing. The one problem with football in particular is that guys don't usually like to open up about those sorts of things with each other.
Oh yeah, tough guys. Why would they do that?
Yeah. Right. So it really takes an assist from a player who's already worked with a psychiatrist to connect that player with other people who've worked with a psychiatrist or psychologist.
Mentorship.
Exactly.
It's mentorship.
Yeah, in a sense, I think so. Yeah.
I was curious about resources. So I'm thinking of somebody that is very gifted, but having issues in other places, IEPs and things of that nature. Is there sometimes and you don't necessarily need to go in depth with this, but is there sometimes an issue with getting IEPs for somebody that is exceptional in one area? Okay, so there's issues with that sometimes.
Yeah, it depends on the school district.
Yeah.
So for the people listening, there is federal law called the Individuals with Disability Education Act that I believe is from 1975 that stipulates that school districts have to provide accommodations to kids who are either exceptional in terms of certain abilities and by exceptional, I mean have precocity. They're advanced in those areas, or kids who have extreme deficits in certain areas. So it's up to the school district to find a way to accommodate those students so that they have a fair chance of getting a reasonable education. So if you are someone who's been identified as very, very advanced in math or science, in some school districts, and I've actually had this come up with a number of parents in the Bay Area who have kids in public schools, there really is nothing for their kids. Because there was something called the GATE program at one point, which in many school districts in California doesn't even exist anymore. But that was the gifted and talented program for California schools. And I think that the same is true in many other states and other school districts. Like if you're someone who can learn things quickly and get a deep understanding without much difficulty, I think a lot of school districts will just respond, that's nice, and it'll be up to the parents to find enrichment activities. If you are someone who is dealing with deficits, then the school district is much more likely to give you an IEP, or a 504 plan.
So they're more used to dealing with a deficit than they are.
Yeah, and I don't blame the school districts. I really think that it probably comes down to where states and federal governments are sending money or earmarking money, or what they're earmarking money for. And if you only have a limited pool of money to spend on education, then I think it makes sense that you're probably going to spend a lot of that money on the kids who are really having trouble keeping up in mainstream courses. It's interesting because there's actually a body of research on predictors of special education enrollment. And the primary predictors tend to be gender, boys more likely,
Okay.
race, and also family economic background. Those tend to be the primary drivers for routing to special education. And by special education, I don't mean gifted education.
Yeah.
I mean the other, on the other end.
Gotcha. All right, everyone, we're going to take this opportunity to take a break. Next week, Dr. Etefia and I will discuss the importance of heroes and role models, access to mental health care, and ways to address poor access to mental health care in the U.S. So tune in sometime next week. Y'all take care. No Supervision, signing off until then.